What would you do if the person you trusted most, the person you believed would protect you at all costs, turned out to be capable of unimaginable horror? Imagine walking into the home of Hollywood royalty. Rob Reiner, the celebrated director of iconic films like A Few Good Men, and This Is Spinal Tap, and his wife Michelle Singer Reiner, a woman known for her elegance, poise, and charitable spirit, and finding a scene that no camera, no script, no imagination could ever prepare you for. This wasn't a movie set. This was real life. And the darkness that lay behind the gates of their $13.5 million Brentwood estate would shock a city, a nation, and eventually the world. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It was a quiet Sunday morning. The sun peeked through the manicured trees of the sprawling property. Birds chirped as if nothing had happened, and yet behind those pristine walls, tragedy had already struck. Rob, 78, and Michelle, 70, had been brutally stabbed to death. Their son, Nick Reiner, 32, the child who had grown up under the glamorous glow of Hollywood lights, living in the guest house on the same estate, was arrested that very night. 2 counts of first-degree murder would soon be filed against him, leaving neighbors, friends, and fans grappling with disbelief, shock, and an overwhelming question. How could this happen? How could a son kill his own parents? And yet, even as law enforcement closed in and media outlets scrambled to report the initial facts, there was something more, something deeper, something terrifying that would emerge from the shadows. A garage. An innocuous, overlooked space where most families store lawnmowers, bicycles, or old boxes, held secrets that would make this story unlike anything Hollywood had ever seen. The garage would not only reveal the horror of the crime itself, but would also expose a series of secrets and betrayals that had been meticulously hidden behind the Reiners' picture-perfect facade. From the moment authorities approached the property, the tension was palpable. The front gates, usually a symbol of security and privacy, now represented a barrier between the world and a horror story that no one could have anticipated. Investigators walked cautiously through the manicured lawns, past the guest house where Nick lived, and into the main home, where the lifeless bodies of Rob and Michelle awaited. Every step carried weight. Every creak of the floorboard seemed amplified in the eerie stillness. And then, after securing the main house, the officers turned their attention to the garage. What they found inside would redefine what the public thought they knew about this family. Lifeless bodies, hidden secrets, evidence of a chilling narrative that was far more complex than a simple murder. The garage, a place that had once served mundane domestic purposes, became the epicenter of a story that would grip the world for months, even years, to come. It was a place where the veneer of wealth, fame, and Hollywood glamour could no longer hide the darkness festering beneath. But to understand the full gravity of what happened, you need to step back, to see the Reiners not just as headlines, not just as actors and directors, but as human beings with vulnerabilities, tensions, and secrets. Rob Reiner, a man whose career had spanned decades, had built an empire of storytelling, directing films that explored justice, morality, and the human condition. Michelle, equally remarkable in her own right, had been the heart of the family, balancing the demands of fame with the warmth of motherhood and the pursuit of personal passions. Together, they seemed untouchable, a Hollywood couple living a life many could only dream of. Yet beneath the glamorous facade, there were cracks. Family sources would later reveal disagreements, tensions, and complex dynamics that, while not unusual in any family, became magnified in the Reiners' world. Nick, the youngest son, had lived in the guest house, a space meant to provide independence but, in hindsight, may have become a place of isolation, resentment, and secrecy. Friends describe him as quiet, polite, sometimes distant, but none could have predicted the horrific turn his life would take. Even the neighbors, who had watched the family for years, were stunned. They remembered barbecues, laughter echoing across the estate, the occasional glimpse of Rob with his iconic smile, or Michelle tending to the garden. It was a world of calm luxury, a bubble that seemed impenetrable. And yet, as investigators later revealed, appearances can be dangerously deceiving. The media descended upon Brentwood within hours. Cameras flashed, reporters scrambled for details, and social media erupted with speculation, misinformation, and public grief. But while the world focused on the arrest of Nick and the brutal deaths of Rob and Michelle, the real story, the secret held in the garage, was quietly waiting to be uncovered. The garage, after all, was not just a storage space. It was a vault of hidden truths, a place where the ordinary intersected with the horrifying, and a place that would eventually reveal evidence that no one was prepared to see. So what exactly was inside that garage? What could drive someone to commit such a heinous act against their own parents? Was this a crime of passion, a premeditated plan, or a combination of factors that defy simple explanation? These are questions that investigators, family members, and the public alike have struggled to answer. And while the police pieced together the timeline, the motives, and the evidence, one undeniable fact emerged. This was not a simple case. This was a story that would challenge assumptions, test the boundaries of human comprehension, and ultimately expose the shocking truth lurking behind the Reiner's illustrious name. Even now, weeks after the initial arrests, the story continues to unfold. Details emerge slowly, like drops of ink spreading in water, revealing darker shapes beneath the surface. For those willing to look closely, to examine the nuances, the contradictions, and the hidden patterns, the garage becomes more than just a location. It becomes a symbol of betrayal, of secrets kept too long, of the darkness that can exist even in the most seemingly perfect lives. And yet, despite all the horror, the tragedy, and the public scrutiny, one question remains. What drove Nick Reiner to this unimaginable act? Was it greed, anger, mental instability, or something even more sinister that we cannot yet comprehend? Investigators continue to sift through evidence, piece together testimonies, and analyze every detail, knowing that the answer may lie not just in the garage itself, but in the complex web of relationships, emotions, and histories that made up the Reiner family. As we begin to unravel this story, it is important to remember that this is more than just a tale of Hollywood horror. It is a story about trust, betrayal, and the thin line between love and violence. It is a story that asks us to question what we see, what we know, and what we assume about the people closest to us. And it is a story that, despite the wealth, fame, and privilege surrounding it, is disturbingly human in its core themes. But the most shocking revelations are yet to come. When the garage doors were finally opened, the world would see that the horror of that Sunday morning extended far beyond the main house. The garage held secrets that would not only shock investigators, but would force every member of the Reiner family, and the public at large, to confront a truth they were not prepared for. And as we delve into the events that led to that moment, the evidence that emerged, and the consequences that followed, you will begin to understand just how chilling this story truly is. This is not just a story about murder. It is a story about secrets hidden in plain sight, about the thin veneer of civility and the darkness lurking underneath, and about the shocking discoveries that can emerge from the most unexpected places. And now it begins. What does it mean to have the perfect life? To outsiders, the Reiners seemed to have it all: fame, fortune, influence, and a family that appeared enviable in every way. Rob Reiner was a Hollywood legend, a director whose films shaped generations and whose name commanded respect in an industry built on glitter and ego. Michelle Singer Reiner, elegant, poised, and philanthropic, balanced her public presence with a genuine warmth that drew people in. Their Brentwood estate, worth $13.5 million, was a symbol of success, complete with manicured lawns, sprawling living spaces, and a guest house where their youngest son, Nick, resided. To most, it looked like a dream, a family living the ultimate Hollywood life. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. For every red carpet photo, every smiling family portrait, there was a layer of tension, a private world behind the gates that the public never saw. Friends and neighbors remember Sunday brunches, laughter spilling into the garden, and the occasional glimpse of Nick riding his bike along the driveway. Yet, beneath the surface, subtle fractures existed, disagreements that never reached the public eye, moments of frustration, and the silent pressures of living in a household defined by success, expectation, and scrutiny. Rob Reiner's life was one of relentless creativity and public exposure. Behind the camera, he commanded authority and precision, a director who demanded excellence from his actors and crew. On set, he was in control, orchestrating narratives, shaping characters, and crafting stories that resonated with millions. Yet, in his private life, even the most successful directors cannot direct every scene. Families, after all, have their own scripts, full of improvisations, hidden motives, and unspoken tensions. Michelle, equally formidable, had carved out her own space in this story. A partner, a mother, a woman balancing a career and personal passions. Her presence was calming yet commanding, nurturing yet discerning. She had managed to create a home that appeared both secure and inviting. But even the strongest walls can conceal instability. Nick Reiner, their youngest, was the quietest of the three children. Living in the guest house provided him independence, yet it also may have fostered a sense of separation. Sources describe him as polite, sometimes reserved, and seemingly content. But contentment is a fragile illusion when family dynamics are complicated, when expectations loom large, and when personal frustrations go unspoken. The question haunting investigators and family alike would soon be: what internal pressures, what hidden resentments, could lead someone to commit an act so unimaginable against the very people who gave them life? For neighbors, the Reiners were the picture of stability. The estate itself was a fortress of privacy, but not one that concealed the warmth of family gatherings or the occasional friendly wave over the garden wall. Yet, it's important to consider that wealth and fame can magnify ordinary human tensions. Sibling rivalries, parental expectations, and the struggle for personal identity often play out in high definition under the scrutiny of the world. In the Reiners' case, these dynamics, like threads woven into a fabric of glamour, would unravel in a way that no one anticipated. Sunday morning, the day of the tragedy, began like any other. Sunshine filtered through the Brentwood trees, birds called from above, and the estate appeared serene. But serenity, in this story, was a mask. Rob and Michelle, preparing for a quiet day at home, could not have imagined that their lives would end in violence, or that the family home would become the scene of a crime so brutal it would shock even seasoned law enforcement officers. And Nick, in the guest house just steps away, would soon find himself at the center of an investigation that would alter his life forever. In Hollywood, the public is used to drama, scripted, polished, and entertaining. But this was real drama, the kind that strips away the veneer and leaves raw emotion in its wake. It's the kind of story that makes people question everything: their assumptions about others, their understanding of family, and even the very nature of trust itself. The Reiners' lives, meticulously curated in public perception, had a hidden narrative, one that would emerge in horrifying clarity when authorities opened the garage. Before we move to that fateful discovery, it's crucial to understand the psychology of a family under pressure. No family is without conflict, but when layers of expectation, secrecy, and fame intersect, they can create a combustible environment. Parents who achieve greatness carry weight that trickles down to children. Children who live in the shadow of legendary figures may experience subtle resentments, self-doubt, or a desire to assert independence in ways that conflict with family norms. Add wealth, property, and public attention into the mix, and the potential for volatile outcomes increases exponentially. Neighbors, friends, and colleagues all spoke of the Reiners with admiration, yet even those closest to them sensed hints of tension. Small disagreements, minor quarrels, and fleeting moments of irritation were dismissed as normal in a busy household. But often, it is these small fissures that, when left unchecked, expand into cracks capable of toppling the strongest foundations. It's a chilling thought that a family who appeared untouchable from the outside could harbor pressures and conflicts so intense that they culminated in murder. Hollywood, with its obsession with image and perception, adds another layer to this story. The Reiners' public lives were flawless in appearance: award shows, premieres, philanthropy, interviews. But behind the camera, real human emotions played out with no script. Anger, jealousy, resentment, and desire are not bound by fame. They exist in every household. What makes this case remarkable, however, is not merely the existence of those emotions, but the extent to which they intersected with opportunity, secrecy, and ultimately, violence. As investigators pieced together the morning of the murders, a portrait began to emerge of a family who, despite appearances, had secrets. Unspoken grievances, unmet expectations, and tensions that festered quietly. This is a pattern seen in many high-profile cases. The outward perfection conceals inner chaos, and only when a triggering event occurs does the facade collapse entirely. The Reiner story would follow this trajectory with devastating consequences, culminating in the discovery of the garage, a space that, until then, had seemed mundane, yet would become the focal point of horror and revelation. The Reiner estate itself is a character in this story. Expansive, beautiful, and carefully maintained, it represents more than wealth. It is a symbol of status, achievement, and family legacy. Yet, it is also a labyrinth, full of private spaces where secrets can hide. The guest house, the private offices, and of course, the garage. For years, these spaces were repositories of ordinary life. But on that fateful Sunday, they transformed into repositories of a nightmare that no one anticipated. So what does the perfect life truly mean? For the Reiners, it was a life admired by millions, yet beneath that admiration lay human complexity, vulnerability, and ultimately, tragedy. As we continue to explore this story, it becomes clear that perfection is often an illusion, a carefully crafted image that can crumble under the weight of reality. And in the Reiners' case, the collapse of that image would be witnessed not on a screen, but in a garage, in a home, and in the hearts of those who survived. By understanding the context, the family, the wealth, the Hollywood influence, and the subtle tensions, we begin to see the stage on which this drama unfolded. Every element, from the sprawling estate to the guest house where Nick lived, plays a role in the narrative. And while many will focus solely on the crime itself, the deeper story lies in the interplay of relationships, power, and hidden grievances that ultimately led to a catastrophic event. As we step closer to the discovery in the garage, it is essential to remember, the Reiners were not just celebrities. They were parents. They were a family. And they were human. In the shadow of fame and fortune, they were vulnerable in ways that no amount of wealth could protect against. The events of that Sunday would shatter the illusion of safety, not only for the Reiners, but for everyone who believed that a family, no matter how illustrious, could be immune to tragedy. But the most shocking part, the part that would leave investigators, neighbors, and the world utterly stunned, was still ahead. When the garage doors were opened, everything that had seemed predictable, everything that had seemed contained, would explode into chaos. The secrets, the evidence, the lifeless bodies, all waiting silently, ready to rewrite the story of a family that had seemed untouchable. It was supposed to be a quiet Sunday morning. The kind of morning where the world feels paused, birds singing outside, the sun casting a gentle glow over the manicured lawns of Brentwood. But for Rob Reiner and Michelle Singer Reiner, that morning would never come. Instead, it became the starting point of a story so horrifying that it would shake Hollywood, devastate a family, and grip a nation in disbelief. The first signs of trouble were subtle, almost imperceptible. Neighbors would later recall the unusual silence, the absence of the usual Sunday laughter drifting from the estate. For a home that had been a hub of activity, friends visiting, staff moving about, family gatherings spilling into the garden, the quiet was unsettling. But no one could have imagined what awaited inside. When law enforcement officers arrived at the Brentwood estate that morning, they were met with the kind of scene that professionals hope never to encounter. Two lifeless bodies, both victims of brutal stabbings, lay in the main house. Rob, the 78-year-old celebrated director, known for crafting stories about justice and moral clarity, had been violently cut down in the prime of his life. Michelle, 70, whose elegance and warmth had long been a cornerstone of the family, shared the same grim fate. The scene was chaotic yet eerily silent, a paradox that amplified the horror. The response from law enforcement was immediate but measured. Officers secured the property, ensuring that no one could enter or leave until the scene was properly examined. For them, this was more than a routine investigation. It was stepping into the darkest corner of someone's life, a place where tragedy had unfolded in the most intimate way possible. Every step they took across the polished floors, every careful movement in the bedrooms and hallways, carried weight. It was a balance of precision and urgency, of compassion and professional detachment. Nick Reiner, 32, the youngest child of Rob and Michelle, was already under suspicion. Living in the guest house just steps from the main home, he became the focus of immediate questioning. Family members, friends, and neighbors were stunned. Could the quiet, seemingly unassuming son, who had lived under the shadow of his father's fame, really be responsible for such an act? Questions raced through everyone's minds. Why? How? And when did this happen? The answers were not immediately clear, but one fact was undeniable. Something profoundly wrong had occurred behind the gates of this prestigious estate. As the day unfolded, investigators began piecing together a timeline. Who had seen the Reiners last? Were there any signs of forced entry? Any witnesses? Initial reports were fragmented, sometimes contradictory, but one element quickly became central: the garage. At first glance, it was a standard suburban garage, a place where tools were stored, cars were parked, and mundane household items accumulated over time. But in a house where appearances masked complexity, the garage was not merely a storage space. It was the repository of secrets, the silent witness to a tragedy that had been planned, or at the very least, allowed to unfold. The scene inside the main house was already shocking, yet the garage promised something darker. Officers moved cautiously, fully aware that every detail could be critical. The air was thick with tension, the kind of tension that makes even seasoned investigators pause and double-check their instincts. As they opened the garage door, the familiar squeak of the hinge sounded unusually ominous. Inside, the space that had once been ordinary now held the potential for revelation, an insight into the motives, the relationships, and the hidden lives of the Reiner family. But before delving further into the garage, it's important to understand the psychological landscape of the day. Sunday mornings are typically a time of rest and reflection, yet in some families, they can be a time of tension. Schedules overlap, expectations clash, and unspoken grievances simmer beneath the surface. In the Reiner household, these dynamics may have played a role in the events that unfolded. A quiet word, a dismissed request, a moment of frustration. These can seem trivial in isolation, yet in a home layered with fame, expectation, and wealth, the stakes are magnified. Every interaction carries weight, every tension is amplified, and the potential for conflict becomes volatile. Neighbors who were later interviewed described the morning as surreal. From the outside, the estate remained a picture of serenity. Immaculately trimmed hedges, the guest house quietly occupied, and the main house standing stoically under the morning sun. Yet the reality inside was almost unimaginable. Two beloved family members had been murdered, and the quiet of the neighborhood now carried a sinister undertone. It was a stark reminder that appearances can deceive, that even the most enviable life can harbor darkness, and that tragedy can strike anywhere, even in places that seem safest. As law enforcement and forensic teams worked to secure evidence, the emotional weight of the scene was evident. For family members called to the estate, the experience was devastating. Siblings, friends, and colleagues arrived, hoping for news, fearing the worst. When they were confronted with the facts, grief and disbelief collided. How could such violence occur in a home that was meant to be a sanctuary? How could a son, someone who shared meals, holidays, and childhood memories, be implicated in the deaths of his parents? These questions would dominate the investigation and public discourse for weeks to come. The media quickly caught wind of the story, and coverage exploded. Social media amplified every detail, sometimes accurate, sometimes speculative. The public fascination was immediate, driven by a combination of celebrity, shock, and horror. People were drawn not only to the murders themselves, but to the complex interplay of family dynamics, wealth, and Hollywood glamour. The narrative was irresistible. A renowned director and his elegant wife, a quiet son living nearby, and a gruesome crime that defied understanding. The story had every element of a dramatic film, but this was not fiction. It was reality, brutal and uncompromising. For investigators, the focus remained on piecing together the timeline. When were the murders committed? What role did Nick play, if any? Were there other victims? Each question led to another. Each clue revealed layers of complexity. And then, there was the garage. A space that, until now, had seemed peripheral, but which would soon become central to the unfolding horror. The garage, in many ways, mirrored the Reiners themselves. Outwardly ordinary, yet harboring secrets that, when exposed, would shock the world. Within those walls, investigators would find evidence that challenged assumptions, defied expectation, and revealed the chilling depths of a family tragedy. What was stored there? Who had access? And why had it remained hidden? These questions loomed large as the investigation proceeded. Yet, even as the garage became a focal point, the human element could not be ignored. The grief, shock, and confusion experienced by friends, family, and neighbors were palpable. People struggled to reconcile the image of the Reiners they knew with the horrors revealed that Sunday morning. It was a dissonance that made the tragedy even more unbearable. A reminder that human behavior is complex, unpredictable, and sometimes terrifyingly inexplicable. The Sunday morning horror, therefore, was not just about the murders themselves. It was about the collision of expectation and reality, image and truth, love and violence. It was about a family that appeared perfect from the outside, yet was deeply vulnerable from within. And it was about the moment when the ordinary, the opening of a garage, became extraordinary in its capacity to reveal the unthinkable. As the day progressed, law enforcement and forensic teams documented every detail, photographed every surface, and collected every piece of evidence. The meticulous nature of their work was essential, for it would not only provide clarity in court, but also begin to unravel the complex narrative of the Reiners' final hours. And through it all, one fact became increasingly clear: this was not a random act of violence. Something more deliberate, more sinister, and more tragic had occurred, and the garage would be the key to understanding it. Garages are often overlooked. To many, they are simply utilitarian spaces, places to park a car, store old bicycles, holiday decorations, or that box of forgotten items in the corner. They are mundane, unremarkable, and largely invisible. But in the Reiner estate, the garage was anything but ordinary. On that fateful Sunday, it became a vault of terror, a space that would reveal secrets so shocking that even seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend the scope of what they were about to uncover. As law enforcement approached the garage, there was an undeniable sense of foreboding. Officers had already witnessed the horror inside the main house, the brutal deaths of Rob and Michelle, but the garage promised a new kind of shock. It was a space familiar to the family, a place Nick had access to regularly, a part of the estate that, on the surface, seemed ordinary. But in reality, it was a silent witness to something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. Opening the garage door was a moment charged with tension. The hinges creaked under the weight of anticipation, a sound that echoed ominously in the stillness. What was behind the metal doors? What horrors had been concealed there? Investigators had to brace themselves. Forensic teams often prepare for the worst, but nothing could truly prepare them for the scene that awaited. Inside, the garage was both familiar and horrifying. The layout was typical of a suburban estate: shelves along the walls, a parked vehicle or two, cabinets filled with tools and miscellaneous household items. Yet scattered among these ordinary objects were the extraordinary and the terrifying. Lifeless bodies, hidden evidence, and items that suggested a chilling narrative lay in wait. The garage, which should have been a place of storage and utility, had transformed into a repository of secrets, one that would redefine the investigation and reveal the dark complexities of the Reiner family. The first discovery stunned the officers. A body, partially concealed behind storage cabinets, suggested that someone had intentionally hidden it from view. The positioning was deliberate, almost as if the garage itself had been used to orchestrate control over the revelation. As more bodies and evidence came to light, the realization dawned: this was not a crime of impulse. This was a crime planned with care, executed with a level of control that defied expectations of familial violence. Nick Reiner's connection to the garage became increasingly central. Investigators had to consider not only physical access, but also psychological intent. Why had he chosen this particular space? Was it simply a convenient location, or did it hold symbolic significance? Experts in criminal behavior suggest that spaces within a home often reflect control, secrecy, and power dynamics. In this case, the garage may have represented both concealment and assertion, a private domain where actions could unfold away from prying eyes. The emotional impact on the investigative team was profound. The juxtaposition of the ordinary. Bikes, storage bins, household tools, with the extraordinary horror of the hidden bodies created cognitive dissonance. Officers are trained to compartmentalize, to approach scenes with detachment, yet even the most seasoned professionals are affected by the scale of human tragedy. There is a weight that comes with realizing that behind every ordinary object, there may lie a story of unimaginable darkness. For the family, the garage represented more than just a physical space. It was a metaphor for the hidden dimensions of their lives. Outwardly, the Reiners were a successful, glamorous Hollywood family. Inwardly, they harbored tensions, unspoken grievances, and secrets that had accumulated over decades. The garage, therefore, became a literal and figurative container of all that had been repressed, overlooked, or ignored, a space where the private collided violently with the public. Investigators began methodically cataloging the contents. Each item told a story. A piece of clothing stained with evidence, a personal belonging that suggested the presence of multiple individuals, and tools or instruments that hinted at premeditation. The forensic team treated every detail with care, understanding that even the smallest object could provide critical insight into the sequence of events, the motives, and the relationships involved. The discovery of multiple bodies added a layer of complexity that had not been anticipated. The initial assumption, based on the main house, was that the tragedy was confined to Rob and Michelle. But the garage revealed that the horror extended further. Each body raised questions. Who were they? Why were they there? And what did their presence signify? The answers were elusive, yet the implications were clear. The scope of this tragedy was far greater than anyone had imagined. Neighbors and the public were soon made aware of the garage, though details remained scarce in the early reporting. The idea that such a space, once ordinary and mundane, could harbor unimaginable secrets captured the imagination of the world. The narrative became a mix of fascination and horror, with each new report adding layers to an already complex story. How could a space that seemed so familiar become a symbol of terror? And what did it reveal about the people who had access to it? Psychologists and criminal behavior experts would later weigh in, suggesting that spaces like garages can serve as symbolic extensions of control, privacy, and secrecy within families. In the Reiner estate, the garage was more than a physical structure. It was a psychological container. It held not only physical evidence of violence, but also a narrative of relationships, power dynamics, and hidden resentments that had been allowed to fester. The bodies and items discovered there were not random. They were part of a story carefully constructed, perhaps without full awareness, but with an unmistakable pattern of concealment and control. The discovery also forced the family to confront uncomfortable truths. For siblings, friends, and colleagues, the garage became a symbol of betrayal. How could someone they trusted, someone who shared meals, holidays, and memories, commit acts so violent and then conceal them in a space they all considered mundane? The emotional impact was profound, not just for investigators, but for everyone connected to the Reiners. Trust, once broken, leaves scars that extend far beyond the physical evidence. Even the physical layout of the garage contributed to the psychological impact. Shelving units blocked lines of sight, cabinets created hidden corners, and the space itself allowed for meticulous concealment. Investigators noted the deliberate positioning of items and bodies, suggesting planning and forethought. This was not a crime of opportunity, it was a crime of intention. Each placement, each hidden detail, spoke to a mind that had calculated consequences, control, and timing. The public, of course, was captivated by the narrative. Headlines emphasized the horror, the wealth, and the celebrity involved. But beneath the sensationalism lay the universal human questions. How can such violence occur within a family? How can secrets fester unnoticed for years? And perhaps most importantly, What does this tell us about the fragile nature of trust, even in those closest to us? As forensic teams continued their work, the full implications of the garage became increasingly clear. This space, once banal and ordinary, had become the epicenter of a family tragedy that challenged assumptions about safety, trust, and human behavior. It was a reminder that horror can hide behind the most familiar of facades, and that even those we believe we know best can harbor secrets capable of shattering lives. The garage also raised questions about oversight and access. Who had entered this space? How long had items and evidence been concealed there? Were there warning signs that had been overlooked? Each question added layers to the mystery, revealing that the tragedy of that Sunday morning was not an isolated incident, but the culmination of complex family dynamics, hidden grievances, and human frailties. And yet, for all the horror and complexity, the garage remained a silent witness, its doors closed to the world, holding within it the evidence of a story that was only beginning to unfold. Every object, every shadow, every hidden corner held a clue. And as the investigation deepened, it became clear that the garage was not just a space. It was the key to understanding everything that had gone wrong in the Reiner household. When tragedy strikes a family, the initial instinct is to seek answers in the outside world. But in some cases, the answers are closer than anyone wants to admit. In the Reiner case, suspicion immediately fell on one person, the youngest son, Nick Reiner. At 32 years old, living in the guest house of his parents' Brentwood estate, Nick seemed outwardly ordinary, polite, quiet, and unassuming. Yet within hours of the murders, he became the focus of law enforcement, family scrutiny, and public fascination. The question on everyone's lips was chilling. Could the son really be capable of murdering his own parents? Nick had grown up under the spotlight of a family defined by fame and achievement. Rob Reiner, an iconic director, carried not just the weight of his career, but the expectations of a public eager to see the perfect family life. Michelle, balancing grace and strength, maintained an image of stability and warmth. And Nick? He had always been quieter than his siblings, living somewhat in the background of both the public eye and family narratives. Yet sometimes, quietness masks complexity, and beneath a calm exterior can lie tension, resentment, and unspoken desires. Friends and neighbors recall a young man who seemed reserved, a person who avoided confrontation and rarely made waves. Yet appearances can be misleading. Close family members hinted at subtle tensions, disagreements over inheritance, differences in lifestyle, and moments of friction that were never fully addressed. In the Reiner household, like many families, emotions were complicated, layered, and often hidden behind the mask of civility. The question haunting everyone now was whether those private tensions had escalated into something unimaginable. Investigators began examining Nick's relationship with his parents in minute detail. Texts, emails, social media interactions, and personal communications were scrutinized for evidence of motive, premeditation, or mental instability. The picture that emerged was one of contradictions. On the one hand, Nick appeared devoted to his parents, occasionally seen helping with estate matters, participating in family events, and maintaining a polite demeanor with outsiders. On the other hand, there were subtle indications of frustration, envy, and simmering resentment. These were not dramatic outbursts visible to the public. They were small, almost imperceptible actions and behaviors that, in retrospect, hinted at deeper unrest. One critical aspect of the investigation was the guest house itself. Living in proximity to the main house, Nick had access to family routines, schedules, and private spaces. This proximity allowed him a unique perspective, but also placed him in constant interaction with the household's rhythm. Family psychologists later suggested that such living arrangements can foster both independence and isolation. For Nick, the guest house may have been both a refuge and a pressure cooker. A place where distance from the family coexisted with constant awareness of familial expectations and achievements. Neighbors provided a fragmented yet revealing view of Nick. They described a man who appeared polite, soft-spoken, and reserved. Yet occasionally, they noticed flashes of frustration, moments of tension when he interacted with staff or family members. These glimpses, though subtle, raised questions about the internal dynamics of the Reiner household. Were these moments indicative of deeper resentment? Did they hint at a psychological struggle that had been brewing for years? When police questioned Nick, the tension was palpable. Interviews were conducted with care, balancing legal procedure with psychological observation. Investigators looked for inconsistencies in his account, signs of deception, and subtle behavioral cues. It was clear that Nick was under immense pressure. Scrutiny from authorities, shock from neighbors, and the looming reality of public judgment. Yet beyond these external pressures, the investigation sought to uncover the internal factors that could have led to such a horrific act. One focus of the investigation was motive. Why would a son kill his parents? Experts debated possible reasons: inheritance disputes, mental health struggles, feelings of neglect or inadequacy, and the influence of isolation. While motive in family crimes is notoriously complex, patterns often emerge. Long-standing grievances, perceived slights, or unresolved tensions can escalate in ways that defy rational understanding. For Nick, the combination of proximity, opportunity, and personal dynamics made him both suspect and central to unraveling the larger mystery. The public perception of Nick added another layer of complexity. Media outlets painted him alternately as a monster, a troubled child, or a tragic figure caught in circumstances beyond his control. Social media users speculated endlessly, constructing narratives that blended fact, rumor, and assumption. In the court of public opinion, Nick was already on trial, regardless of what evidence investigators would ultimately uncover. This scrutiny placed immense pressure on both the family and law enforcement to uncover the truth as quickly as possible. Psychological experts emphasized the difficulty of understanding someone in Nick's position. Living under the shadow of legendary parents, coping with wealth, fame, and societal expectation, and experiencing internal family tension creates a unique pressure. When tragedy occurs, these pressures are scrutinized, magnified, and dissected. Investigators had to ask not only what happened but why, and whether the motive was rooted in calculated intent, emotional breakdown, or a combination of both. As the investigation progressed, attention turned to Nick's movements on the day of the murders. Witness statements, surveillance footage, and forensic evidence were examined meticulously. Every step he took, every interaction he had, and every action in the guest house or main estate was analyzed. Investigators sought to reconstruct a timeline, understand his mindset, and identify potential triggers that could have escalated to violence. Each piece of evidence provided insight, yet also deepened the mystery, revealing contradictions and raising new questions. Family dynamics further complicated the picture. Siblings and extended family members grappled with disbelief, trying to reconcile the image of Nick they knew with the growing evidence pointing to him. Some described him as loving and considerate. Others hinted at tension or rivalry that, while subtle, might have contributed to a breaking point. Understanding the interplay between personality, environment, and opportunity became central to the investigation, and to understanding how a tragedy of this magnitude could unfold within a family home. One particularly chilling aspect was the access Nick had to the garage. As investigators would later reveal, the garage was more than a storage space. It was a repository of secrets, a controlled environment where evidence, and, ultimately, bodies were concealed. Nick's connection to this space became crucial. Was it a place of planning, execution, or concealment? Was it symbolic, representing control over the family or the unfolding tragedy? Each question added layers of psychological and investigative complexity. Public fascination with Nick's role was intense. Documentaries, news specials, and online discussions speculated endlessly about his mental state, motives, and potential influences. Yet behind the speculation lay a human story of a family grappling with incomprehensible loss, and a young man whose life had become the center of a narrative darker than any Hollywood script. It was a reminder that real-life tragedy is rarely simple, rarely clean, and often defies easy explanation. Ultimately, Nick's position as both son and suspect created a tension that would dominate the investigation. He was simultaneously the product of his environment, a participant in family dynamics, and a potential perpetrator of violence. Understanding him required examining the intersection of psychology, opportunity, family history, and human behavior. It was a complex puzzle, one that would not be solved easily, and one whose pieces were hidden not just in the guest house, but in the very spaces where family life had unfolded, the garage, the home, and the memories that tied them together. And as investigators began to piece together the evidence linking Nick to the garage and the murders, one chilling reality became clear. The story was far from over. The quiet son, the overlooked family member, the person who appeared harmless to neighbors and friends, had a central role in a tragedy that was only beginning to reveal its full scope. When the call came in, the officers assigned to the Reiner estate knew they were entering a case unlike any other. Celebrity homes, Hollywood families, and wealthy estates are not uncommon for law enforcement, but murder inside such a household, particularly involving one of their own, required meticulous precision, acute sensitivity, and a readiness to face the unimaginable. The Brentwood estate was a maze of luxury, privacy, and security, and navigating it required both procedural discipline and psychological awareness. Every room, every hallway, every corner could hold clues or horrors that would be central to solving the case. The initial sweep of the estate began with securing the perimeter. Officers cordoned off the property, ensuring no one could enter or exit without permission. Neighbors watched from behind hedges, cameras from media outlets trained on the gates, and the quiet tension of anticipation hung over the sprawling estate like a storm cloud. Inside, the main house had already revealed its horrors. Rob and Michelle, brutally stabbed, lying in lifeless stillness. But law enforcement knew that the main house was only one part of the story. The garage, the guest house, and other private spaces were just as important in reconstructing the sequence of events. Investigators immediately began collecting forensic evidence. Photography teams documented every inch of the home, from the angle of the bodies to fingerprints on door handles. Blood spatter patterns were analyzed, helping to reconstruct the movements during the attack. Even minor details, like the position of a fallen chair or a scuffed rug, were meticulously noted. In cases involving familial homicide, small details can provide enormous insight, and investigators approached each observation with the same seriousness as a high-stakes crime scene. Nick Reiner became the primary person of interest almost immediately. Living in the guest house, he had proximity to the victims, knowledge of the estate, and access to every room, including the garage, which would soon become the focal point of the investigation. Law enforcement officers had to consider both physical and psychological access. How well did Nick know the layout? Could he have planned, executed, and concealed his actions within a space as complex as the estate? Every step of the investigation required them to examine not only physical evidence, but also behavioral and relational patterns. Witness interviews were conducted with painstaking thoroughness. Neighbors, family friends, and staff members were questioned, each narrative carefully cross-referenced against others. Some observed unusual behavior from Nick in the days leading up to the murders: irritability, quiet withdrawal, or fleeting frustration. Others noticed nothing at all. These conflicting accounts required investigators to piece together a timeline not only of actions, but of emotional states, subtle cues, and potential triggers. The human element, as always, was as critical as the physical evidence. The forensic team's attention then turned to the garage. Once considered a mundane utility space, it now held the potential to unravel the mystery entirely. Officers noted the placement of tools, cabinets, and objects, recognizing patterns that hinted at intentional concealment. Evidence collection was painstaking. Every item, clothing, tools, personal belongings, even dust patterns, was photographed, cataloged, and analyzed. The presence of lifeless bodies inside the garage added an urgency and complexity to the investigation. Unlike the main house, where the victims' deaths had already been established, the garage contained evidence that could reveal additional motives, timelines, and potentially other victims. Interrogations were scheduled with precision. Nick was questioned multiple times, each session conducted by a team of detectives trained in handling high-profile, familial homicide cases. Investigators observed every reaction: microexpressions, hesitation, shifts in tone, body language. Every pause, every glance, and every inconsistency was noted and later analyzed in the context of forensic findings. It was not enough to know where he had been. Investigators needed to understand his state of mind, his potential motives, and his connection to the garage itself. Simultaneously, the investigation incorporated digital forensics. Phones, computers, security systems, and surveillance cameras were examined to determine movement patterns, communications, and potential planning. Investigators looked for evidence of premeditation, any indication that the garage had been used strategically, and whether there had been prior attempts to conceal activities. In cases like this, digital breadcrumbs often illuminate hidden intentions, providing clarity where human memory or testimony may falter. The scale of the investigation also required coordination among multiple agencies. Local law enforcement, specialized homicide units, forensic experts, and even psychological consultants collaborated to ensure every angle was considered. Every room, every item, and every interaction underwent scrutiny. The investigators were acutely aware of the stakes. This was not only about solving a crime, but also about ensuring justice in a case with intense public and media attention. Mistakes could not be afforded. While physical and digital evidence was collected, investigators also considered the psychological dimension. Familial homicides often involve intricate emotional triggers, resentment, envy, fear, or long-simmering conflicts. The Reiner case was no exception. Interviews with family friends, childhood acquaintances, and even distant relatives revealed subtle tensions and patterns of behavior that might have escalated over years. Every interpersonal detail became a piece of the puzzle, essential for understanding how a tragedy of this magnitude could unfold. The discovery of multiple bodies and evidence in the garage dramatically shifted the trajectory of the investigation. Initially, law enforcement focused on the main house, expecting the narrative to be relatively straightforward. But the garage, with its hidden contents and signs of meticulous concealment, suggested planning and intentionality beyond initial assumptions. Investigators had to reassess every timeline, every interaction, and every motive. It became clear that the garage was not a peripheral space. It was central to understanding the full scope of the tragedy. As the investigation deepened, the challenge of distinguishing between evidence and deception became apparent. In familial crimes, suspects often mask intentions, conceal emotions, and manipulate perception. Nick's behavior, both before and after the murders, was scrutinized for inconsistencies, anomalies, and possible indicators of guilt or distress. Investigators also had to account for the possibility of coercion, influence, or prior planning that extended beyond individual motivation. The complexity of human behavior, combined with the physical evidence from the estate, created a case that required both scientific precision and psychological insight. Media coverage intensified during the investigation. Headlines emphasized the celebrity factor, the gruesome details, and the dramatic narrative of son versus parents. Public fascination grew, but investigators had to operate independently of public opinion. Every statement, every leak, every speculation risked contaminating evidence or influencing witness testimony. Maintaining the integrity of the investigation became a paramount concern. Every stage of the investigation reinforced one critical reality. The garage was more than a physical space. It was the key to unraveling motive, sequence of events, and the psychological dynamics that led to the murders. Items within the garage, hidden clothing, tools, and other objects, spoke volumes. Patterns emerged that suggested planning, concealment, and possibly the presence of other victims or evidence of prolonged behavior. This realization forced investigators to approach the garage not merely as a storage area, but as a central character in the unfolding tragedy. By the end of the initial investigative phase, a picture began to emerge. A young man living in proximity to his parents, navigating the pressures of family expectation, personal ambition, and complex emotions, had become the focal point of a criminal investigation whose implications were both personal and public. Every piece of evidence collected, every interview conducted, every digital trail examined contributed to understanding not just what happened, but why it happened, and how the garage factored into the execution and concealment of the crimes. Yet, even with all the evidence and meticulous investigation, one fact remained clear: the story was far from complete. The garage, the bodies, and the intricate web of family relationships contained secrets that were only beginning to be revealed. Investigators realized that solving the case would require patience, psychological insight, and relentless attention to detail. Every answer uncovered seemed to raise new questions, deepening the sense of mystery and suspense surrounding the Reiner estate. In every high-profile crime, there comes a moment when investigators realize that the smallest, most overlooked details can carry the heaviest weight. In the Reiner case, that realization struck as law enforcement sifted through the garage and the surrounding estate, uncovering evidence that was subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profoundly telling. These hidden clues, like whispers from the past, began to paint a picture of events far more complex and sinister than anyone had anticipated. The first clue emerged almost by accident. A drawer in the garage, seemingly ordinary, contained items that didn't belong: a set of gloves, carefully folded, a pair of shoes that bore traces of blood, and small tools placed in precise alignment. At first glance, these might have appeared mundane, remnants of household chores or casual storage. But forensic analysis revealed patterns inconsistent with normal usage. The gloves were smudged with traces of DNA, some belonging to Rob, some to Michelle, and some to unknown sources. The shoes contained microscopic blood splatters matching the victims. And the tools? They suggested careful manipulation, positioned to obscure their use, to blend into the ordinary environment of the garage. Investigators began cataloging these items with meticulous precision. Photography, fingerprinting, and DNA sampling became critical in establishing the sequence of events. Every smudge, every fingerprint, every piece of residue carried the potential to reveal motive, timing, and method. The hidden clues were not just physical, they were psychological. They revealed intent, planning, and an awareness of consequence. Someone had taken great care to conceal evidence, while simultaneously using the garage as a staging ground for the crime. Among the most chilling discoveries were personal items belonging to Nick himself. Journals, notes, and digital communications found within the garage hinted at emotional turbulence, obsessive patterns, and internal conflicts. While no document directly confessed to violence, the content suggested deep-seated frustration, anger, and preoccupation with family dynamics. Psychologists reviewing the material noted recurring themes of perceived inadequacy, resentment toward parental expectations, and a fascination with control. These hidden clues became as important as the forensic evidence itself, providing insight into the mind behind the act. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the placement of certain objects in ways that seemed symbolic. Tools and equipment were arranged in patterns that suggested ritualistic or deliberate behavior, almost as if the perpetrator was creating a controlled environment within the garage. Investigators noted that these placements were precise, deliberate, and consistent with behaviors seen in other cases of premeditated familial homicide. The garage had become more than a storage space. It had become a controlled stage where actions unfolded according to a hidden script. Forensic teams also discovered traces of blood beyond the obvious stains. Microscopic droplets on shelves, faint smears on cabinets, and subtle transfers on objects indicated movement within the garage that was carefully choreographed. This was not the chaotic scene of a spontaneous act. It was the result of careful execution. Every movement, every placement, every concealment was deliberate, leaving investigators to consider the level of planning, forethought, and psychological control involved. Investigators then turned their attention to digital evidence. Security camera footage, though limited, revealed movements around the garage and guest house in the hours leading up to the tragedy. Timestamp analysis, cross-referenced with witness accounts, showed patterns of activity that suggested foreknowledge and preparation. Small actions, like opening cabinets or moving items in specific sequences, were initially overlooked, but upon closer examination, they became critical in understanding the sequence of events. These hidden digital clues reinforced the narrative established by the physical evidence. This was a planned, controlled, and deliberate act. The investigative team also noted discrepancies between initial witness statements and the forensic findings. Some neighbors had reported seeing Nick outside briefly that morning, Others noted no unusual activity. Cross-referencing these statements with physical and digital evidence revealed subtle inconsistencies, small details that might otherwise have been dismissed, yet in this case, they became pivotal in reconstructing the timeline. Hidden clues, in essence, were guiding investigators to a more accurate and complete understanding of the events that unfolded that Sunday. Psychologists involved in the investigation emphasized the importance of context in interpreting these hidden clues. In family homicides, behavior often escalates over time, and small, seemingly insignificant actions can foreshadow catastrophic outcomes. The arrangement of objects in the garage, the personal items indicating frustration or obsession, and the precise concealment of evidence all pointed to a trajectory of behavior that had been developing for months, if not years. These were patterns, not coincidences, and they provided insight into the psychological state of the individual at the center of the tragedy. Even the public, when briefed on certain aspects of the hidden evidence, reacted with shock. People were fascinated by the idea that a seemingly ordinary space could conceal such deliberate preparation. Questions abounded. How could such planning go unnoticed? What motivated the precision? And what else might be hidden in plain sight, waiting for investigators to uncover? These questions only deepen the sense of horror surrounding the Reiner case, highlighting the complex interplay between environment, psychology, and opportunity. One particularly chilling aspect of the hidden clues was their implication for timing. Blood spatter patterns, footprints, and the placement of objects indicated a sequence of actions that suggested the crime was not impulsive but meticulously timed. Investigators had to reconstruct this timeline with painstaking care, understanding that even a single misstep could distort the narrative. Each clue, no matter how small, became a thread in a web that revealed not only what happened, but when, how, and potentially why. Family members, too, began to grapple with these hidden clues. For siblings and extended relatives, the discovery of carefully concealed items in the garage added a layer of betrayal to grief. How could someone they loved, someone they had trusted, orchestrate such a calculated act in the space they all shared? The hidden clues were not just evidence. They were a revelation of intent, a window into the psychological landscape that had allowed this tragedy to occur. And as investigators continued to examine the garage, they began to uncover patterns.